Thank you. So that was some music, some compositions, and some artwork by our Lady of the Hour, Hildegard von Bingen. And I just wanted to welcome you all and just say how thrilled I am that so many people are interested in these female mystics from throughout Christian history. This is a great turnout, and we're going to have a wonderful presentation to begin our three-part series. Just a quick introduction to our thinking behind this series, and then an introduction to our guest speaker this morning. As many of you may know, the idea of wisdom, the personification of that amorphous, omnipresent spirit of deep knowledge and truth, which has been something of a holy grail for people of all faiths, especially in our Judeo-Christian tradition, is often personified within our scriptures and outside of them as female, as a sort of co-creating spirit with God in many articulations, like a mother bearing the thought or the logos or the word or all of creation into being. So we thought, as we were looking to wrap our program year this year, who better to help us in pursuit of this holy wisdom than women themselves, women who have often been overshadowed or overlooked throughout Christian history by their male counterparts. Now, we have seen in recent years a resurgence of interest in these figures, which is a wonderful thing. But we wanted to encourage that in our own parish. So for these final 3 weeks of adult formation for the program year, we've selected just 3 of the many female mystics to focus on, coming from different eras in the history of the church. And we'll start today, as I said, with Hildegard von Bingen, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess whose works were some of the most important to come out of the medieval church. And it was not just writings that she produced, there was music, there was art too, and that's some of what you saw and heard at the opening of our session. Next week, we'll move on to Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English anchorite who penned the earliest surviving work by a woman in the English language, and whose work that was Revelations of Divine Love, as it was entitled, was one of the core inspirations for our theme at the parish this year of Love Dwells Here. And then finally, we'll jump forward to the current day and learn about the contemporary mystic and the mystical tradition as carried forward by Cynthia Bourgeot, who is an Episcopal writer and retreat leader and wisdom bearer to us all. But today, we are lucky to have with us Marjorie Bankson. Marjorie's an author, an artist, and a spiritual guide who lives in the DC area. And she has written, among other things, 2 books, one called Call to the Soul and Creative Aging. And in a follow-up email that you'll get links to those books in case you're curious or desirous of purchasing them and reading them for yourselves. And Marjorie specializes not only in Hildegard, but also in the hard and holy work of discernment, of call, of transition, both in our lives and in our institutions. So it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Marjorie this morning, who will introduce us even more fully to the incredible treasure of Hildegard von Bingen and the great tradition of medieval female mystics. So Marjorie, I turn it over to you and I welcome you and say thank you for being with us this morning. Let me just make sure that you are unmuted there, and you will have us all to yourselves now. Go for it, Marjorie.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoy being here, and we will have a time for question and answer at the end of the session. I want to start actually with the end, with what we've just been seeing. Someone in the chat asked, are these tapestries? No, those were paintings, and they were probably not actually done by Hildegard. They were probably done in the scriptorium of her convent. These are visions that she had, and she describes them in writing very completely. And she probably supervised the paintings themselves. And they're rather small, 8.5 by 11, not much bigger than that, maybe 11 by 14. And in the scriptorium, there would be the writing, and they would leave a space then for these illustrations, because this is the period of illuminated manuscripts. So just that word about her visions and what you were seeing. I'm going to go back to the beginning of her life, and I'm going to be kind of telling her story. And we will be taking a pause after each segment. And if you have available the spiral of call, which we sent out, I'll just give you a few moments to make some notes on that spiral, because my understanding of call is that it's like the soul's code or the DNA that's built into it, and that over time it manifests differently. And for Hildegard, that was certainly true. Let's start with the fact that she was born the 10th child of a local prince living in medieval Germany. You know that Germany was not unified until the 19th century. So it existed in these small courtly properties, if you will. And Hildegard, at the age of 8, imagine that, was given to the local church as their tithe, their dedicated child. She joined 2 others as in an anchorage attached to the abbey at Diesen-Bodenberg, and lived in rather severe isolation. From Jutta, the anchoress to whom she was dedicated, she learned to write and read in the vernacular German. She, throughout her life, said, "I'm not a scholar, I'm unlearned." And that's not precisely true. She grew up within the church rituals. She did know how to read and write German, and she probably knew how to read Latin too, but she does not have a scholarly background. By the time she is established, she takes vows as a Benedictine nun at the age of 18. So she herself is beginning to feel a call or a vocation as a nun. That was not necessarily true for a child like Hildegard, but she did feel called to the religious life, and lived in this rather isolated environment with a few other nuns at the time when this abbey began to expand, and the men who were enjoying the dowries of women who joined the monastery this way. They, of course, brought a dowry of property, often vineyards, often what was considered real wealth, was then guided or controlled, really, by the abbot there. When Jutta died at the age of 44, Hildegard was selected to be the next abbess of what was then about a dozen nuns. So this is it's a small community, but within that small community, she is obviously showing some leadership. At this time, we have no writings, we have no records of illuminations, nothing special happening as she approaches the age of 40. So if you think about your own life and think about what was happening for you spiritually by the time you reach 40, I think in our culture, we would think, well, nothing much is going to happen if it hasn't happened now. And in fact, I think what we see is a remarkably faithful, studious, able woman offering leadership to this small group. But inside, she begins to go public with visions that she has kept quiet about, through her childhood. We learn later that she has been having these visions, and what they involved were, some people named them as migraine headaches. They were full of light, full of power. She would hear voices, and she would often take to her bed. Her health at that time was, I have to say, looking back, it couldn't have been fragile, but she spent a lot of time taking to her bed, apparently. As she became the abbess of this group of nuns, she begins to name to her spiritual advisor these visions that she's having, because she begins to rely on the visions as guidance. So this takes us into the second period, the middle period of her life. I think of this as the period between 40 and 60, which is really the period of her claiming her voice and the authority of her visions. She is assigned by the local bishop, the Bishop of Mainz. She's assigned a secretary, Volmer, who's a monk. And Volmer really stayed with her almost throughout her life. From the time she was 40 until he died when she was 75, Volmer was her primary secretary. He did read and write Latin, which meant that he had a scholarly background. And it was he who really made her visions known until she began at a later time to do preaching. But remember that at this time, we're talking 12th century here, at this time, women were to be quiet. They were not to be teaching or preaching. When she became the abbess, she saw what was happening around her and decided that her nuns needed to be separate as a community. So she began a discussion with the abbot about bigger quarters, more, not only more space, but more authority for the women. And of course, she was blocked. He wasn't at all interested in giving her more authority and voice. And Hildegard, with the help of Volmer, did something that I think conveys her wisdom and her savvy. She wrote a letter to Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a well-known Cistercian reformer. She had never met him, but she wrote a letter and included a description of at least one of her visions and asked him to read it and essentially bless her visions as authentic, as coming from God and not from migraine headaches. And Bernard apparently read this letter. The exchange is still extant. You can still read them. She goes on and on about being a poor, uneducated woman, not authorized to speak, except that this comes directly from God, and she begs for his blessing. And in the end, he not only accepts that, but he sends a delegation to interview Hildegard and decides, yes, these are authentic visions and they should be honored and acknowledged by the church. And it was really his blessing. So she went around her immediate authority to get the blessing of someone who had the ear of the Pope. And that gave her a kind of protection for continuing with her writing and teaching. If you look at your timeline, you will see that this interchange with Bernard happened when she was about 48 years old. So she's been recording her visions now for almost 10 years before she seeks his blessing and his support. With that in hand, she then begins to pressure the abbess where she's living to establish a convent of her own. By this time, there are 18 nuns under her guidance, and they are bursting at the seams. I mean, they're living in very small quarters, and she has her eye on an old rundown monastery that is nearby, near Rupertsburg, at Bingen, and that she's known as Hildegard of Bingen, but she doesn't arrive at Bingen at Rupertsburg until she's almost 50 years old. They undertake renovating that monastery to establish her own convent. And she managed not only to move with her 18 nuns, but to get the abbot to release the dowry that those 18 nuns had brought to the monastery. And the way she did that was she uses this tactic again later. I'm sure she wasn't planning to do it, but she took to her bed and she essentially threatened that she might die if he doesn't release the nuns and their dowries. And I'm reminded of this with what we're seeing with Navalny in Russia right now with his hunger strike. There is something that puts pressure on the authorities when you have a now famous woman who simply wants what is their own, possibly dying on your watch. He didn't want that to happen, and so he releases them and they move with their vineyards and their dowries and even their servants to this new monastery at Bingen. It's not simply a conflict between Hildegard and the local abbot, though. These women are caught up in a larger struggle for power between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. And the interesting thing to me is that Hildegard refused to side with one or the other, but she had a lively correspondence, not only within the church, but with local political leaders. By the end of her life, we have 100 letters, 9 books, 70 poems, and about 72 songs as a result of her output. Now, remember, this isn't her private cache. She didn't produce all of those things by herself. She had the help of a fairly established convent. By the end of her life, she has somebody who will write her letters. She has somebody who will do the illustrations. So she's the head of a convent that has resources to make her writing available. Nevertheless, by the time we get to the end of this middle period, when she's approaching the age of 60, we have her first book, Scivias, which translates into know the ways, and you might say, know the ways of God. And this includes her illustrations and her descriptions. If you read Scivias, you will see that her theology was not radical. It's fairly traditional. However, she has her visions give her what I think of as the basis of mystical understanding, which is oneness with God. And whenever you have that oneness or fusion or direct input from God or the Holy Spirit, and she talks about the Trinity a lot. So it isn't just God as Father, it is God, Holy Spirit, and actually Mary is very much part of that Trinitarian understanding for her, that she writes about having direct conversations with the Trinity, with Lady Wisdom, with Mary, the mother of Jesus. And these direct conversations are what she writes about. She writes often in dialogue form. So this teaching, this writing that she's doing is also coming out of what she offers within the convent. Now remember that she is not authorized to bless the Eucharist. She is supposed to be having a priest come and really do the service for her nuns. But by the time she publishes her first book, Hildegard is regularly teaching and preaching within her convent. And a lot of the visions that get published in that first book are visions that she has discussed and elaborated on herself as a teacher and preacher. So I'm going to pause right now and suggest that you look at your spiral of call and notice that in the first period, which I identify really as, in her case, age 10 to 40, which is when she became the abbess, that she is grounded in the convent. She finds stability in practice, in the vows of the Benedictines, and there was a freedom and creativity that she got from her visions. I'd like you to think about your own life and think about that period up until the age of 40, which I think of as kind of midlife. What is it that gave you a sense of stability or grounding? And how did you experience creativity or expansion or something more? I'm just going to stop talking for about 3 minutes and let you consider that or make any notes you want to make on your spiral about Hildegard's life and perhaps your own life. And then we'll pick up again. Let me draw your attention now to the illustration that I think you can see. This is one of the early illustrations in her book. What you see here is Hildegard pictured with the illumination of her vision, which she, as I said, experiences as light and direct contact with God. She is making notes on a wax tablet, and that's Volmer off to the right, who then will translate this into Latin and into a book form. This illustration is fairly simple, and I'm going to show another one, which you saw earlier. Which is a later illustration. Notice the difference here. This is called the Tree of Life, and it's a much more elaborate illustration. This is toward the end of this, say, 40 to 60 year period. And it really describes her understanding of the cosmology, the seasons. This tree of life is also the world tree. So she understands the earth as the center of the universe, the seasons around the edge, and around the circle, you see flames. She understood God and the Spirit of God as flame, as the Holy Spirit. And down here on the left, you see she is pictured, and there is a kind of golden path there and a hand reaching out of this vision. And that's how she expressed her experience of receiving this vision from the divine. So this really describes her later teaching. And you can see in these two illustrations how her own thinking developed and got more complex, more detailed, and very much rooted in the natural world. Let those go. We'll go back. As we go along, if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, we are going to have a period for question and Q&A at the end. So you might just make a note of those. We'll go back now to her later period. Once her first book was published, they got busy in the scriptorium. They made a number of copies of that book. And so she began teaching and also communicating with people who would then ask for a copy of that book. And their convent began to grow. The books attracted new people. So she really began to ramp up her writing, her preaching. By the age of 60, she published a second book in a theological book. And she also began writing music, or the music began to find notation. You remember that this is a period of Gregorian chants. Gregorian chants basically had a very odd notation. There was no grounding. You couldn't tell where a Gregorian chant started. Some of you may be much more knowledgeable about Gregorian chants than I am. But one of the things that she did was she began her own notation for music. It was performed within her convent. She considered that music was part of the visions that she received directly from God. And she called music the language of God. And I think that not only were they performing this much more complex version, these are not Gregorian chants. These are really mystical antiphons, perhaps is the right word. And it began to draw lay people as well as the nuns. It wasn't long before she realized that they really needed a second convent. And so she got permission to build a second convent across the river. They are located right where the Nahe River joins the Rhine. So she's one of the Rhineland mystics. And they build this second convent across the river, which was very good protection because these convents, remember, there's no protection except a small wall around the convent. And this was a time of a lot of political upheaval. This is the period of the Crusades. People are marching off to the Holy Land, but they're also trying to take land. And so there were times when the nuns had to get on a boat and go across the river for their own protection. And as I said, she then begins to draw quite a following, and that was protective, a following among the local people of the town surrounding both convents. I would say that this is the period of the most fruitfulness in her life. She begins what she calls preaching missions. Remember, again, this is a time when women are not to be teaching and preaching. She has 4 preaching missions, one of which takes her to Paris. One author said she tucked her books under her arm and went in an entourage to the University of Paris, where she preached, and was welcomed as a scholar, even though she continued this womanly stance of being an uneducated woman, totally dependent on these visions from God. Her last great battle came after Volmer died. Volmer was her dedicated secretary his whole life. And when he died, the local bishop appointed someone else who was more scholarly, and Wibert began to take it upon himself to correct her grammar and to put things in a more orderly form. And she knew enough to spot that. And it really irritated her. And so she really had a battle with the, the local bishop about this new secretary. And part of that battle was a struggle for power and a struggle for authority. And this came to a head right at the end of her life. At age 80, she is still the abbess in her convent. And there's a young soldier who apparently had left the church and came to their convent, and she hears his confession and gives him absolution, and they bury him in the church grounds there in the convent. And the local bishop wants her to dig him up because the local bishop hadn't heard that final confession. And it is said that Hildegard herself went out and completely destroyed all signs of where the grave was. And she stood her ground that they weren't going to dig up the soldier, that she was fully able to receive his confession. And the Pope put them under interdict. And what that meant for them was that they could not take Eucharist and they could not perform music. And that's what Hildegard objected to the most. The fact that they were silenced from performing her music led to what is one of the most wonderful exchanges. She writes to the Pope and says that if she dies, he will be guilty of cutting off the voice of God. Not that it's her voice, but the music. And so the Pope lifts the interdiction, and they are once again allowed to perform the music that has become so central to her identity. And I think she takes a deep breath and she dies 6 months later of natural causes. But she has succeeded in guiding her convent through these political battles so that they can once again perform the Holy Office and the music that was so central to their life together. I want to say one word or a few words about what happened after that, because right after she died, there was an effort to make her a saint, and that failed. The next pope, this is a period when there are a whole series of popes, and just because she had a friend in the papal office didn't mean that that lasted very long. And the next person of the next person, I can't remember exactly the timing, she kind of fell out of favor and disappeared from the church's view really until this century. In 1927, you'll see this at the bottom of your timeline, the original manuscript of Scivias, which was her first book, was photocopied at Rupertsberg, which is the second convent that she founded. And they began a handmade copy of that original manuscript. The original manuscript was taken to Dresden for safekeeping during World War II on the thought that the Allies would never bomb Dresden. And you know what happened. Dresden was flattened. The manuscript has never been found. It is thought that the original manuscript was destroyed by Allied bombing, but the copy had been made by the Benedictine nuns in Rupertsberg. And after the war, I think it was actually Evelyn Underhill's book and her work on the mystics around the turn of the century. Underhill goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was Evelyn Underhill's interest in the mystics that then led to, after the war, interest in Hildegard and Hildegard's manuscripts. So that in 2012, very recent, Hildegard was made a saint in the Catholic Church. And so today, she is revered and has a saint's day, and is joining what I think of as the circle of mystics that we can celebrate today. So I'm going to pause now and open this up for questions.
Marjorie, thank you so much. That's what a fascinating woman and a fascinating life, and
I know.
much to learn from. And it's just, yeah, I mean, the twists and turns are almost like a Hollywood story, right? And I think sometimes we may think of mystics as a sort of weak and waifish characters, but it seems like she had a savvy and a backbone and a toughness about her that that was not did not mean she could not also have beautiful spiritual revelations that came to her as well. So it's a wonderful thing. I wonder if people have questions they might ask. You can ask verbally, or you can put them in the chat, and I can feed them to Marjorie for us to talk together for a few minutes here. We have a little over 10 minutes. So I hope that this presentation has spurred some questions in you. We had one question that came through that Boykin just offered to everybody because I think it would be helpful. Marjorie, could you talk a little bit about what exactly an abbess was and did in that 12th century context, and what it meant to be the abbess of a particular convent?
Well, it's a position of extraordinary power and authority. Usually, now this is the feudal period, and so these convents were generally in rather rural areas. That's not an urban setting, and they were basically self-sufficient. This is really before the money economy of urban development. And so it was a barter economy, and most convents had to be self-sufficient in what they produced. And so they would have had vineyards, they would have had fields, which the nuns by and large did not tend. So they had people who did those things. And abbess was in charge of it all. And so she would have been aware of farming, agriculture. Actually, her writing are very interesting. She has a book of recipes. She was very much interested in healthy living. Many of them involve spelt. She's a big advocate of simple eating, less meat, more vegetables, good oatmeal every day, and beer. She was not one to avoid beer. She also had a lot of homeopathic remedies. She was a healer, and so they would have had an infirmary. One of the ways she got into trouble before she founded her own convent was that they were often sought out for medical advice and midwifery by local townspeople. There were no hospitals at that time, and so a convent might be a resource for medical help, basically primary education for girls. So it's a very responsible position at this time in history.
Marjorie, that's wonderful. More than just making sure that the church offices happen through the day. I mean, there's a lot going on, and they're really
practically not, because they are still supposed to have a male priest coming to do the Holy Office.
That's a great point. And I think also relates a little bit to Suzanne has just put in the chat a great question about the fact that, I mean, you kept going with her life, right? 20, 40, 60, 80. To live to 80 in the 12th century was no small thing. And so I think some of what you're saying is she had a commitment to healthy living and also an awareness of how to take care of herself and encourage others to take care of themselves too. We just had a creation care series, and they told us to eat less meat and more vegetables. So maybe we should pull out some of those recipes as well, which is great. Alice Cotton, a wonderful question about how far back the originals go, or the works that we have of hers, the paintings, the writings, or the paintings done of her visions, the writings. I know the music we have is performed from some of her manuscripts, but for you, and couched in that, I think what Alice is trying to get at, where did your interest in Hildegard spring from, and what have been some of the exciting opportunities to engage with it in its, at least at most, original form?
Well, this is interesting. I would say that my interest came from Matthew Fox. I took over an organization called Faith at Work in 1985, and I went to a creation-centered, week-long thing, and bought a poster. I knew nothing about Hildegard, but it was one of the things that you saw before I started speaking today. It's called the Symphony of Creation, and it's really her cosmology And in the middle is an opening, which she considered the presence of the Holy Spirit. And then there are faces, human faces, and then angelic faces. And it cuts the framework of the picture. It's bigger than that. And I bought that poster, and it hung over my desk at Faith at Work the whole time I was there, long before I did any reading about Hildegard. It was her art, her vision, that actually drew me in. And then this is a book I would highly recommend if you're interested. It's called Illuminations, and it's by Matthew Fox, and I see that it was copyrighted in 1985. And it's probably out of print now, but I'm sure you can get it as a used book. It has wonderful descriptions in her own words of those illuminations. It's not all of them, but it's a good compendium of her illuminations. So my interest started there, and it's been more recently, actually during the pandemic, that I have done any concentrated reading in the women mystics. I've been in love with the medieval mystics during the pandemic.
That's good. Well, people not unfamiliar with plague and isolation as well, so maybe they had a word for us these days. That's wonderful. I love Marjorie. It's her visions that captured your vision, right? And it was her writings are obviously prolific and important, but it was just that direct sense of communication of sight that was for her the source of her authority, and also now some of yours, which is a wonderful legacy to lead. Marilyn McNamara has a wonderful question. Were there any other key aspects of her teaching and writings in terms of the content, the theological content, that are particular to Hildegard? You talked about that sense of oneness with God, that direct input. Obviously, we can read the readings on our own, but are there things that we should know that she contributed as major aspects of her thought?
I would say in many ways she's quite traditional in her thinking, very Augustinian.
Okay.
She has a very keen sense of hell, and the play, I didn't mention the play, but as part of her music, she developed a morality play, and many of the dialogues have to do with the virtues. And she really sees that there's a cosmic battle going on between the virtues and, hell. And this play is thought to be the very first opera, because it is music and dialogue. And you will see, in contrast to Julian of Norwich, who did not believe in hell. So Julian's thought is a century later and develops out of this. But I would say Hildegard, in her own way, maybe what is unique is she does set it in a cosmological framework. It's not just human. So she really sees it as part of a creation story. And that is fairly unique.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Marjorie. And I'll just remind everybody, in the handouts that you got emailed ahead of time or were placed in the chat today and will be sent around again tomorrow, there's a wonderful bibliography that Marjorie has provided us with that are works about Hildegard, works by Hildegard, some CDs you'll get some recommendations on if you'd like to listen to some of her music. So these are tools you can carry with you as you seek to have a companion on the way here in your own spiritual life. So Hildegard can continue to walk with us. And videos. Sarah Malone has just put in a nice comment about the videos that are available, and she recommends that. So you'll have a list of some videos you could find and watch about her and her life, which again would continue the story here. And Henley, I wonder if you might say a little bit about your comment, your thought here about the similarities of the life between this 11th and 12th century woman and the contours of your own life. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Well, I was struck by just how closely her life, I wish I could say that I had done anything like what she has done, but in a very small way, I see that my own life, the ages sort of tracked with hers. And I was struck again by the power and the authority and the inspiration she drew from a community of women. not just, it's the spiritual gifts that she clearly had, but her power and her seizing her own power and taking it into the world and going head to head with the structures around her. It really, I found it quite remarkable and inspiring.
Wonderful, Anne. Thank you. And Marjorie, I appreciate, Anne appreciates, and I appreciate, and I hope others as well, the way you framed this in sort of modeling it, her life. It's nice to learn about, but then to force us to reflect or ask us to reflect on how our life parallels that, and to think 1,000 years ago, some of the same contours of life were still emerging for human beings as they tried to make their way in the world and be faithful as they did so. So thank you for that.
One of the things that I was really aware of is in the spiral, I've made a note about stability and escape, or stability and creativity. It seems to me that in our excuse me, in our modern life, we discount the need for stability in favor of creativity and innovation and so forth. But she really benefited from that kind of community and regularity of life to give birth to her creative energies. I remember hearing Joan Chittister say something very similar about the Benedictines. She said, I couldn't be out here speaking to you without my community of nuns praying for me back in Erie, Pennsylvania. And there is that sense of being grounded there so that she could be free to speak.
There is that fascinating paradox, Marjorie, and I know the Catholic tradition has it, but we certainly have it in our Episcopal Church as well, where the sense of this rule of life, this rhythm of prayer, this sense of a liturgical tradition that some people experience. Evelyn, our preacher this morning, our youth preacher, if you haven't seen, you should go back and watch, was talking about how she had that first instinct of, why is everybody just saying the same prayers over and over? It's just, they're not even thinking, they're like robots. There's a certain freedom that comes from grounding oneself in prayer or worship that then allows one's soul a certain amount of enough stability to feel comfortable to escape, to be creative, to be released almost. And there's that interesting balance or tension that can easily get out of balance about the way in which that happens. And I think what you're asking for is that sense of balance that allows one to feel at home and at peace, such that their soul can be released into these flights of wonderful inspiration.
Well, words like discipline are very unpopular these days, but it's the same root as disciple. And I think that's exactly what she was so aware of, both in her eating, her exercise. Really, it's humorous in a way to read what she has to say, because she's quite didactic about those things. But I think we can see the fruit in what she produced.
That's wonderful. Well, our time is up, unfortunately. Fortunately, we continue the conversation next week. But Marjorie, I want to thank you again for being with us today and getting this series started and inspiring in me a desire to learn more and pray more with Hildegard. So consider yourself you got one convert here at least. And also, I want to thank our Spiritual Life Guild, who reached out to Marjorie originally and was familiar with some of her work and were able to invite her to us, and also were the inspiration for this series. Those of you who are interested are welcome to be a part of that planning committee, who try to think up ways in which we can enrich our spiritual life here at the Chapel of the Cross. So you'll have some information in your email tomorrow if you're interested in participating in that more, about being a part of that wonderful committee. But Marjorie, thank you so much. Next week, we move on to Julian. Move forward a little bit, not too far. Amanda Bourne, our very own, will lead us into her life, and it'll be a wonderful exploration, continued exploration of some of these themes you helped us unpack, Marjorie. But in the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you soon, okay?
Thank you.
Peace be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.